White has many choices on move 4 to deviate from what would you consider standard theory, but still make a very decent attempt to fight for the initiative. Here we're going to see a relatively new try that was not taken seriously for many decades, but made a little bit of a resurgence in the late 90s, early 2000s, in which White tries to change the dynamic of the position a little bit. We're going to be talking about this move, bishop to g5 on move 4. Without even really analyzing this move in depth, it is clear that it has some serious drawbacks, and it's important for White to play precisely, not to fall into a worse position. On the other hand, this is more of a high risk, high reward kind of thing, as if White is able to finish his development successfully without his bishop being hemmed in on c1, as many variations in the nimzo-indian are, he will be able to claim a very strong advantage. Notice that we already given up the center in a way, and White wants to take the center, take the development, and basically do everything he can to neutralize Black's play. All at the same time, which sounds a little bit overambitious, and honestly it probably is, but Black still has to respond accurately. For example, a natural move like d5 is already not great. First of all, of course, knight f3 would transpose back into the main channels of the Ragozin, but much more sedate and much better is a simple move e3, after which Black doesn't really have all the resources that he has in a normal Ragozin, such as d takes c4 or h6 and g5, as White has an option of developing bishop d3, knight e2, and immediately the pawn on c4 is already defended. I believe that d5 is already quite an inaccurate move, and you almost never see it at the top level of chess. In this case, after bishop g5, there is an argument to be made about playing h6 first, but I will explain in just a second why I think the move c5 is just a little bit more accurate. After c5, there really isn't a choice for White, and that's why I like the move c5. Something like knight f3 is way too ambitious in this kind of positions. After c takes d4, knight takes d4, I have many options on getting an advantage with Black, mostly related to the move queen a5, directly targeting this bishop on a5 and the knight on c3. And this really doesn't make any coherent sense for White to develop in this kind of fashion. Instead, he takes the bull by the horns. He goes d5 in this position as the most accurate way of playing. And the reason you can't play e3 just to solidify your center is because you run into the same tactical problems. For example, queen a5, attacking here on c3, knight g2, and since I've managed to unpin myself, I have this strong resource of knight e4, attacking this bishop on g5, attacking this knight on c3, and as I said before, if White plays inaccurately, he runs into a lot of trouble, and this is one of them. After knight e4, I have an attack on g5, I have an attack on c3, and this is just not a playable position. The whole point for the White side is that after bishop g5, c5, they tend to go d5. Now this resembles in some way a Benoni structure, with the strong caveat that this bishop is on b4 instead of being flanqueroed on g7, and of course that this bishop on c1 is now on g5. So this changes things quite a bit, and I'm recommending to throw in the tempo move h6 in this position. We'll analyze the structure and we'll see that the move h6 is very useful for the Black side, and it has really no drawbacks. Now, if White were to develop the bishop backwards towards f4 or d2, well, it just doesn't happen, and it's a weak move that does not fight for the center. After bishop f4, for example, takes, e4 is no longer under White's control because the pin has disappeared, and after a simple move like castle, probably Black's already better. If you want to be more ambitious, knight e4, attacking on c3 with the threat of queen f6 is probably even better, but you will likely never see the move bishop f4 played against you. After h6, it also makes no sense to capture on f6, because after queen f6, Black commands the dark squares and is threatening the knight on c3 and has absolutely nothing to worry about. If anything, I think that Black's already clearly better. So the only logical move after h6 is to play the move bishop h4. So now we can start taking a look at strategically what's going on in this position. White basically sacrifices his structure in the sense that I can take on c3 whenever I want, crippling this pawns on the queen side. It is very important to note, sometimes in the nimzo-indian, your opponent will try to throw the kitchen sink at you, and you have to be able to respond properly. And I think this is one of those cases in which white is risking strategically, but on the other hand, if he plays his cards right and black doesn't, he might be able to get a strong edge out of it. So here we have bishop h4, and there are several moves here for the black side, but I like the simple d6, opening up lines, especially the knight coming to d7. The bishop can target e6 if white ever decides to take on e6. This is a very important feature in the position later on, and we'll see that the timing of d6 is very good right now. Let's say that white plays a move like f3 just to play e4. We'll see that he doesn't really need to do this, and he actually runs into trouble. For example, castles, e4, rook e8, and due to the tactical details of the position, this center is just not something that's going to hold on. Even a simple move like knight g2, notice that it's already important to cover this e file. Something like bishop d3 fails many cases to pawn takes, and I can already look at variations like g5, breaking the pin by force, allowing me to take on d5 using the fact that the pawn is actually not defended at all. But something like knight g2 takes on d5, and knight d7 is already very awkward for the white side. First of all, remember that this pin is not permanent. I can always play g5 and get rid of it. And it's not easy to find a next move for the white side. a3 doesn't really help. I'll just move my bishop back. And how do you develop? This knight on e2 is kind of in the middle of everything. I would have preferred to have developed this bishop first, but I haven't been able to get that coordination that white wants from these positions. And in effect, he's actually just much worse. It's very difficult to play this position for white. Just even try finding a couple of good moves. Black, on the other hand, is a very logical play. My knight's going to go to e5. At some point, I will push my pawn to g5, and I will either expand on the queen side, pressure your center, play knight h5 and f5. I have a myriad of possibilities that are very easy for black to find, and white doesn't actually have a plan. If after d6, white decides that his structure is actually very important, he can play the move rook c1, but this kind of meek attempt to keep the position in balance is usually going to backfire when you've already committed a bishop to g5. After rook c1, pawn takes d5, knight d7, e3, queen a5. It's already again difficult for white to defend everything. This pawn is actually being targeted because his knight on c3 is not covering on a2 due to the pin. Something like a3 is so slow because after bishop takes c3 check, again, what do you recapture with? With the pawn, well, a3 is not going to be defended. With the rook, again, tactical problems for the white side, stemming from the fact that he hasn't developed enough in this position to justify the way that he's playing. Therefore, after d6, universally the move is e3 in this position. And after e3, you could make some argument, and since knight e2 is a very likely next move for white, if I don't take on c3, that this is a good time to take on c3 for me. So bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and again, black has choices in this position. Castles is probably the main move, but I like the alternative queen e7 as a slightly more flexible way of playing. After queen e7, white has two realistic ways of developing. Either he pushes for a very early bishop d3, knight e2, or he develops this knight on g1 first to f3 and then to d2. We're going to take a look at the more aggressive approach first and the more old-fashioned one with bishop d3. Bishop d3 immediately takes control over the e4 square and allows this knight the flexibility to either go to e2 and g3 or to go to f3 directly, depending on the reply from black. Now we're going to keep ourselves flexible as well. We're going to play knight b to d7. And here, knight e2 was the move that had presented more problems for black, but I think it's no longer really that relevant. After knight e5, which I like quite a bit, taking advantage of the fact that this bishop doesn't have too many squares. It doesn't really want to retreat. It definitely doesn't want to retreat all the way to b1, but that's the only way it can retreat and keep the bishop alive. For example, if bishop c2, I can take on c4 now. Notice that this is not something I could have done against bishop b1, because knight takes c4 here is met with queen a4 check. Now after knight e5, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to take your bishop on the next move, but it does present this idea that I can take back the pair of bishops pretty much whenever I want. The move bishop f6 was seen in a very top level chess at the end of the 80s. Bishop f6, queen f6, and castles was the game Miles versus Karpov in 1986. Now Karpov decided to go a little bit too aggressive in this position and play the move queen h4, which led him into trouble. But the very logical and simple castle short, I think, really solves all of black's problems. Notice that after an expansion such as f4, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, white would be very happy to just push all of his pawns and slowly steamroll me down the center. Unfortunately, I just don't have that many pieces alive anymore. And that's good for black, because since I'm running out of space, I don't want to have an army that I can't really maneuver. In essence, when you have less space in chess, you want to trade pieces. I've already successfully done that. Not only that, but I have crippled your pawn structure. And I think that after the very simple move b6, followed by an excellent placement of this bishop on a6, white is already in trouble. He doesn't really have the time or really energy to advance these pawns, because even if they advance, I'll just move my queen out of the way, and it's not so clear what you accomplish with this. But more importantly, after bishop a6, I'm going to be at some point running to take on d5, use the pin, use the pressure on c4, bring my rook to e8, and any advance by white might simply backfire. Already black is in the commanding seat in this position. For this reason, going back after knight e2, knight e5, I think a more sedate idea is here to play the move f3. This allows control over e4 and, very importantly in many cases, the retreat of the bishop from h4 to f2 will allow him to at least retain control of the dark squares. However, I still don't think that this is particularly dangerous, and after f3, short castles, e4, b6, castles, we have a very interesting type of position in which both sides can go wrong, but I think that black is perfectly fine. This was seen in the game Bilhumian against Parligras, and we will analyze how bishop a6 is probably the better move compared to the game. This will be in the supplemental game attached to the video. After knight bd7, of course, it is not necessarily true that white will develop knight to e2. He can also play simply knight f3. A more logical way of developing with the idea that if you don't do anything as black, I will simply short castle and play e4 and then try to compensate my structure with a pair of bishops. Since this pin is kind of annoying, especially with the queen on e7, I will eventually have to play g5 somehow or another. And the theory is that at this point, this will be a difficult thing for black to hold if white decides to counterattack on the king side, for example after g5, bishop g3, playing a future h4 and attacking on that side. However, part of the reasons that I'm recommending the move queen e7 instead of short castle is to have that flexibility in which I don't have to determine immediately where my king is going to be. I think that the most precise move that was already employed by the former women's world champion Hu Yifan, knight b6, is definitely the way to go. In the game that she played against Tushin Tungsbachimek from Mongolia in a Grand Prix in 2014, the game continued d6, bishop e6, knight e2, and an excellent move, long castle instead of short castle, that gave black just all of the initiative in the position. We'll take a quick look at this game also as an attached game to this file, as I think it really exemplifies what black can do in this kind of positions when he's not really worried about what white can do or the pair of bishops, but takes the initiative in his, or in this case, her own hands. Knight b6 was played in that game, and I think it is the most precise. White shouldn't panic and take on e6 the way that Bachimek did, but I think after the move short castle, he still doesn't really have an advantage. After pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, white has done something that is very common in the nimzo-Indian. Sacrifices the center, but gains time for development and keeps the pair of bishops alive. This is a position that has been seen a few times, and white almost always chooses the move queen d2. A flexible move that defends the pawn on c3 allows this rook to enter the game via d1 or e1, and also retains strong threats in some cases of playing e4, and this queen will be eyeing the king side immediately. Practical tests have shown that after the move castles, rook d1, g5 is a very appropriate response, with the idea that after knight takes g5, pawn takes g5, bishop takes g5, queen e5 is a perfectly acceptable way of playing for black, and white doesn't really have an initiative at this position. So since the sacrifice of the knight is just unsound, after bishop g3 we get to a complex game in which both sides have chances. Now it's clear that this rook on d1 seems very logically placed to pressure this pawn on d6. However, practically speaking, it seems easier to play with the extra pawn, and the target on d6 is not fixed. I can just move my knight from d5 and play d5 at some point myself. I believe that after castles, rook e1 is a much better move that has not been played in practice, but I believe it is dangerous for the black side. The idea is that if I've played g5 in this position, after knight takes g5, pawn takes g5, bishop takes g5, this pin becomes extremely annoying. I don't want to move my queen back because e4 will be targeting the knight, and that might be the only defender of f6. And the tactical justification of why this is different than the variation that we just looked at is that after queen e5, f4 sometimes becomes a major issue. Notice that in this position, this pawn on e3 is currently defended, so I cannot play queen takes e3 check, and I run into a very strong tactical problems. White is already clearly better in this position as the attack is difficult to refute. There are better ways to play for black than queen e5, but I already consider this to be a little bit too dangerous. I don't see the need to castle short and ask white whether he is willing to sacrifice on g5 or not. I believe that after queen d2, it is much more precise instead to play the move knight c7. Knight b6 also deserves consideration, but I believe that knight c7 is a cleaner way towards a little bit more than equality. And it also challenges white to find a good move. If you play something normal, for example e4 in this position, then after g5, bishop g3, knight h5, it's already unclear where white's compensation lies. Now, of course, when I play g5 without castling, it doesn't even worth considering to take on g5 for white. And after knight h5, I can simply attack this bishop on g3. I will take it very, very soon. I'll regain the pair of bishops. I still haven't decided whether I want to castle short, I want to castle long, how I want to set up all of my pieces, and I will be able to simply play something like bishop e6, long castle or short castle depending on the situation, break with d5, and be up a pawn. White doesn't have the development to justify this kind of aggression. Instead, I think h3 instead of the move e4 is a more sedate and better way of playing. The point being that after g5, bishop g3, knight h5, I've created a little bit of a cubbyhole for the bishop to attack down this diagonal, at least retain that measure of compensation. And after g5, it's true that bishop g3 is already very dangerous for black, but since you've played h3, there is no reason for me to pursue your bishop. Instead, the simple move d5 I think is very important, taking control of e4 and c4 for the black side, allowing me to have a more dynamic development with bishop on e6. And notice that this knight also creates a very important defense of the b5 square, so there's no bishop b5 checks for me to worry about. And in essence, after d5, rook fe1, castle, it's already white that has to try to bail out into some sort of equality with the move e4. And it's not so easy to suggest something that's not e4. For example, the move rook d1, I can simply develop with rook d8 or bishop e6, and at the end we're going to have something very similar to what we're about to see, but the move rook d1 was probably not as useful as, for example, bishop e6. Queen c1 has been played in a grandmaster game before, although after g5, knight g5, this is all still very murky. The simple move queen e6 I think is quite good. The idea being that after c4, I've unpinned this knight and I can move it to e4, which is a very, very nice way of playing for black. After knight e4, you can see that this pawn is hemmed in, this rook is trapped on e1, so black really obtains very good play. It's very likely that the bishops create just about enough counterplay to retain equality despite the lack of a pawn, but it's black to be preferred, and white is really fighting for equality in this position. Instead, after the move rook fe1, castles e4, we reach a very simplified endgame after d takes e4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, using tactics to our advantage. Bishop takes e7 is the only move that doesn't lose a serious amount of material, or just gives black a free pawn. Knight takes d2, knight takes d2, rook e8, and bishop c5. After we reach an equal endgame, although equal with a little bit of an asterisk, I do have the better pawn structure as black. I probably can push a little bit, although to be fair, with the opposite color bishops, this will usually end in a draw with good play. Now, if your opponent made it this far, good for him. You are still pressing a little bit with the black side, and I think this is a very satisfactory opening result. This stems from the move bishop d3, and I think this quick maneuver of knight bd7, knight b6 offers black fully active counterplay, and that white has to be a little bit careful in order to equalize precisely. In this position, after b takes c3 on move 8, queen e7, the main line still is knight f3, not rushing to develop the light squared bishop, which in many cases doesn't really have a useful purpose on d3. Sometimes the bishop even hems in the queen that wants to develop on d2 and keep that control over d5. So knight f3 is a very logical move, and after knight bd7, part of the reasons that white rushes the development of this knight to f3 is to play the move knight d2. Now the point of this move is to control the center and allow white to play the move e4 while not exactly running into the tactical complications that we saw in earlier versions of this move. Knight d2 is one of the main lines of this bishop g5 variation, and it's definitely one of the trickier ones. Now, of course, instead of knight d2, bishop d3 would have transposed to something we have already seen in the Bg5 Yifan game. Queen c2 doesn't really make any sense because after knight b6, I am attacking the spot on d5, which is not so easily defended because remember that e4 is still quite pinned, while the move bishop e2 doesn't control the square here on e4, and after g5, bishop g3, I think knight e4 is a very accurate way of putting pressure on white's position, as c3 is a problem. Taking on g3 is always an issue for black. d6 is currently defended, so pawn takes e6 is no longer a tactical threat, and black gets excellent play. Instead, we're going to focus on knight d2, which I think is much more dangerous, and here I like the move b6 played by Tomaszewski. And I think that this is another clear example in which hurrying with short castle in many of the nimzo-indian side variations is not really necessary. And here b6 I think is a much more important move than the move castles, and we'll see in just a second why. After bishop d3, bishop b7 is again an issue because it's not easy to defend this pawn on d5. e4 again, issue with the pin. So the bishop is usually developed to e2 with the idea that after bishop b7, I have the move e4. I'm going to just sidestep a little bit and show what happens on the move castles. Here, after g5, bishop g3, I can take on d5. I'm going to point out that the move castles is also possible. I'm going to get into detail here in just a little bit of why this is a good move. But it's also possible to take on d5, and after h5, which is a little bit of a precision move, forcing h3, knight takes d5 leads to a slightly better position for the black side. I am taking a pawn, I am taking on c3 also, so it's important for white to do something active immediately. Knight c4 looks like a very strong move as taking on d6 is threatened, but I can block this with knight e5. And the best that white can do is try to fight for the equality with knight takes d6, queen takes d6, e4, taking advantage of the spin. But after long castles, it's still difficult for white to fully equalize, as I am a pawn after pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, and there really isn't enough compensation. Notice that it's important that this pawn sometimes is defending against bishop g4 check. That's why we threw in h5 earlier in the variation, and overall this is a very awful task of defense for the white side, not what they want to get out of the opening. Instead, after bishop b7, I think the move e4 makes a lot more sense, just keeping the center controlled. And now there are several ways to play for black, but I want to recommend a new one that has not been tried before. And the reason that I'm doing this is that I analyzed this position quite extensively, not only with one engine, but with several, trying to get to the truth of it. And I was playing around with this position with Stockfish, which is pretty much as good as engines get. But I was having a little bit of trouble finding the ideas for black after short castle and sometimes g5 or e5, sometimes knight e5, knight g6. I wasn't really making things work. Progress was okay. I think that black's position was acceptable, but the strong center was a little bit annoying and it was difficult to recommend it as a practical way of playing chess. I turned on Stockfish's competitor, Leela, which is based on a different way of approaching chess, and I have to say that I was very happy with what Leela was suggesting. That computer, as opposed to Stockfish, was thinking that black is worse, except for the plan long castle. Now, long castle looks like a weird move in this position, because after all, didn't I just prepare short castle for a long time? Isn't the b file kind of semi-open? Isn't the black king in a little bit of jeopardy on this side? And the answer is actually it's not. The pawn on b6 can always be defended. Something like a4 actually completely loses the thread of the game, because after a5, will never be enough artillery on the b6 pawn to cause me any problems. This knight doesn't have a good way of attacking the pawn on b6. This bishop is very, very far away from it. And all I really need is a knight on d7 to anchor this pawn for the rest of the game. It's going to take forever to white to create a threat on the queen side. Even when they do create it, I can put my king on a7, my queen on c7, and it's not going to go anywhere. In essence, the queen side is already locked down. And instead, I'm eyeing the fact that it's white that can't really go to the queen side at all because he has crippled the structure there. And I'm going to use the fact that I don't have my king on the king side to just push my pawns forward, go g5, h5, and attack on that side of the board. My idea is g5, h5, and if your opponent takes here, it doesn't really help him. After queen takes f6, queen c2, g5, black has a very strong initiative with control of the dark squares. And again, I'm never going to be worried about my king on c8. It's extremely safe. Difficult for white to find a plan in this kind of positions. After long castles, short castles, I think the move g5, bishop g3, h5, h4 is extremely good. Now, if you analyze this with a weak engine, and trust me, I'm not using any weak engines to do any analysis in this position, you'll see that Stockfish starts hating this position. And then it thinks and it thinks and it thinks and realizes that it's not easy for white to find a plan, and it's also very difficult for him to keep the king side protected, and starts changing its evaluation slowly. It recommends the move rook h g8, pawn takes, rook takes, with the idea that after bishop h4, simply retreating the rook to g7, keeping ideas such as rook to g8, attacking on g2 open, or playing knight e5, knight g6 to get rid of this bishop as very interesting active possibilities. And it starts giving the evaluation at zeros, it starts saying it's about equal, but honestly I find this a little bit unpleasant to play for the white side. If you don't think that that's the best continuation, you can play like Leela does, which I think is incredibly ingenious, and play the move knight h7, a very artificial looking move, but actually a very dangerous one for white. The point being that bishop takes h5 is never going to be on the air, as opening the h file is more or less suicidal. Playing h takes g5 again allows moves like h4, and again, taking on h4 is not really a possibility. After knight takes g5, you're basically getting crushed down the h file. This king on g1 is not really going to survive. You haven't created any counterattack on the other side of the board. Instead, bishop h2 can be played, but again, queen takes g5, rook coming to g8, that king on g1 suddenly very vulnerable, very difficult position for white. After knight h7, it's much better to try to keep this king side together with knight f3, but I like closing down the center, queen c2, and maybe even f6 like Leela suggests, and the plans kind of play themselves out. Rook g8, knight f8, g6, f4, threatening to the point gh4, threatening g4 at some point, whereas white doesn't really have that possibility to create threats on the other side. Remember, I'm not moving this knight in this variation to f8, g6, f4, because I wanted to be the knight on h7, such a way that a4 can be met with a5, and again, this pawn on b6 easily defendable, no real way for white to make progress on the queen side. This is a new approach to this version of bishop g5. I think there was still very much play in the old version with short castle, g5, e5, but this way of playing by Leela, who claims the black is already better, I think might even put a very strong question to this entire bishop g5 line if it is playable at all. I think this is already very uncomfortable for the white side. This long castles is a nice novelty, and I believe that white has to be very careful not to lose this in the next few moves to even try to come up with a plan. And I think the move castles might already be a better version of black than any of the positions that have been seen in practical tests, as in none of them do you want to have your king on g8. You always want to have it on the queen side. I will to put the d8 rook to function on g8 and start pushing and putting pressure. This line with bishop g5 isn't something that you'll see all the time. It's something that's used as a surprise weapon. It's something that you see a little bit offbeat. I don't know anybody that has this as their main repertoire and as their only way to deal with an nimzo-indian. But now you are equipped with a way of dealing with this move whenever you see it on the board. And not only equipped in the sense that you can equalize these positions, but honestly put pressure on white from the get-go, trying to claim that, hey, black can fight for the advantage as early as move 4 if you play moves in the nimzo-indian that are not as harmonious and as developing as the main lines.